Hello, welcome to Wood Stuff with Hutch. Now let's face it, us woodworkers have a lot of fear. What do I mean by that? I mean, we see other woodworkers doing things we wish we could do, and we're afraid to even try sometimes. Now I've found that some of the best ways to learn is by jumping in and just doing it. And with Handcut joinery, I certainly know I could develop better skills in that area. So I'm going to go ahead and make this video about my first attempt at a half-lap dovetail joint. Now, do I have some fear? Sure. I want it to be perfect. But let's face it, perfection never comes. There's always going to be something wrong with it. So let's go ahead and see what happens when I make this joint without any practice. So to begin with here, I just have 2 blocks of wood that are milled to the exact same dimensions, and I just make sure that there's a really tight, perfect joint end to end for starters. Here I'm going to lay out 1 inch from the end, and in this case I've decided to make the dovetails 1 inch a piece. So for starters, I do the 1 inch for one side and 2 inches for the other. You'll see how this plays out later. But right now, I'm honestly just fumbling my way through layout, and I'm not exactly sure where I'm going. It's kind of funny. And you'll see later how often I have to rethink what I'm doing. So on this piece, I'm using my bevel gauge to lay out the dovetail, which will be 2 inches in from the end. And here I'm just going to scribe these lines around the rest of the sides of the piece. And here on the opposite side, I'll be marking the tails. On the other side, I was just marking out the pins. And so I'm here just using the bevel gauge once again. And now I'm actually ready to begin the cutting of the joint. Now this is the underside from where I scribed the tail, and I just am using a handsaw here to rough cut the joint, and I'm staying proud of the scribe line. Now in this case, you could use a table saw or a circular saw even, setting the depth, and leave it proud of the scribe line so that you can come back later to chisel like I'll be doing with this handsaw joint. So here we are now. I'm at the pairing stage where I'm going to sneak up on the scribe line and the final surface of the joint. And this right here is a 7/8 chisel, and it was not working well, and I couldn't figure out why. Later on I did figure out. So I switched over to a 1/2 inch chisel, and it just went right through it, easy as butter. And both the chisels had been freshly sharpened, and one of the reasons is a wider chisel requires a lot more force to cut through the wood, especially end grain. And here I'm just sneaking up on the final cuts here and essentially trying to leave a very little amount of waste on the waste side of the scribe line. So now that I've pared it down, I got my 1/2 inch chisel again, and I'm dropping it right into the scribe line and going to pare down gently, trying to be as square as possible, trying to follow not only the scribe line on the top of the piece, but the one that is on the edge of the piece, so that it's nice and square and going to give me a clean fit. And we jump ahead here, and you can see how that face is really starting to shape up. Excuse my mallet. And you see how nice and straight and clean this face is starting to look. So once that's done, I'm going to go ahead and clear up the other face. And I decided I'd start with a shoulder plane, but I realized I forgot to scribe the center line. I just used a pencil mark, and so since I hadn't cut the wood at that point, that shoulder plane just blew out the back edge, as you can see here. So I switched over to the 7/8 chisel, not having learned my lesson that it wasn't working properly, and found myself struggling here, but slowly and surely I was carefully working my way down to that final line. And so now I'm just coming back and doing a little cleanup, getting rid of any fuzzies or places in the joint that appear like maybe they're not flat or might interfere with a good fit. And I just went ahead and did the same process with the walnut piece. And here I'm just doing a test fit, kind of seeing how things are coming together. Not bad. I'm not too displeased, but there are definitely some gaps in some areas, so, not amazing. And after the way things were laid out previously, I decided I should smarten up and actually grab my marking gauge rather than just scribing using a square. And so I incised the center line finally, and now I'm going to go ahead and just mark out the end of where the pin should be. Now, if you remember, I kind of did some of this already earlier, and that was me just fumbling around, realizing that I didn't know what I was doing. So now we're ready to go ahead and start sawing the dovetails. And in this case, again, I'm using a hand saw. You could use, other than a back saw, you could use a coping saw if you really wanted. Or if you have an oscillating tool, a power tool, you could use one of those to go ahead and trim this down. And again, I'm leaving this proud of the scribe lines. Then I go ahead and do the other side real quick, and then I put it down in my vise and finish up the rough cutting. Now things are really starting to shape up, and we actually have something that looks like a dovetail. And this is where things start getting exciting for me. And I always am worried, what's going to happen at this point. But here again, I'm taking my 1/2-inch chisel and just sneaking up on those scribe lines, paring down very gently. So now I'm ready to start cutting the tails, the pins. And you see here, I'm having to come in at an angle since there's wood in the way that I don't want to be cutting. And I just go ahead and cut the two sides of the pins. Now, one thing that I did was mark this way too early in the process. For this particular joint, I didn't need to use just layout tools to create the guidelines and the scribe lines, but really this should have been done after I had already cut the tails, and I just used the tails themselves to make the scribe lines. Then it would have been much more accurate. Now we're ready to move on to chopping out the tails here. And this is a half-blind dovetail really, so that's why you have to use the chisel to chop it out rather than being able to find a better way to do it. I suppose if you really wanted to get fancy, you could set up a template with your router to rough out the joint, but I mean, that's a lot of work when you could just do it by hand. And I find doing it by hand is so satisfying, and I'm not exactly sure why, but it makes me feel like I'm accomplishing something. So I'm just chipping my way back, taking about an 1/8 inch at a time, and then coming back in from the end and chopping it out. And in the same manner, I'll just continue to work my way down, again staying proud of the scribe lines. And then after the bulk of the material is cleared out, I'll come back and really clean up to the lines and get as precise as I can. And here you can see that I'm just taking the finished cuts and doing some very gentle paring, taking extremely light shavings, trying to do the final cleanup of this part of the joint. And of course I do this with the other piece as well, and once that's done, we're ready to do an actual fitting. And here I have those 2 parts cut, and the real test now is to see, will they come together? And they do come together, which is a good feeling, but they came together just a little too easily. That means that the joint's a little sloppy and that it needed to be tighter, because you do want to have a friction fit. And now I'm just going to take a moment to analyze the joint and actually critique myself. And I think this is a part of the learning process that's really important. On that side, it looks like the dovetail joint's pretty decent, but as we go around, we see the sides start opening up, and the underside, this poplar dovetail, is very loose and quite sloppy. So something went wrong, and I honestly think it was mostly layout. So as you can see, there's a lot here that I have to improve. So as I do a really thorough analysis and critique of what I'm doing, one side is a little tighter than the other, and a lot of this had to do with my inconsistencies in layout. So in the future, I think I'm going to be more careful to try to use marking gauges as much as possible instead of using a square like I had been doing. The other thing I think that I need to just stick with is a narrow chisel rather than trying to use wider chisels. These narrow chisels seem to just go through the wood so much easier, and I feel like I have a lot more control. And the other thing is, the wide chisel I was using, the 1-inch, that was about a 35-degree angle, and it was just too steep of an angle. Chisels should be a lot lower angle than 35 degrees. So that was a sharpening error on my part. Then the other thing that I would do differently is, in case some of you with really good eyes noticed, I was using the wrong saw for the wrong kind of cut. I was using a cross-cut saw for a ripping operation and a rip saw for a cross-cut operation. So, a lot of mistakes, a lot of things I can improve, but I learned a lot, and I'm really looking forward to doing more of these videos where I take these complex joints and make them on the first try and share with you what I learned. So I hope you got something out of this. And please like and subscribe this video if you enjoyed what you saw, and I will see you next time.